15. Gay liberation, American liberation. Gay people weren't always renegades, but once they rejected the goal of becoming good Americans, they broke open myriad freedoms and pleasures for all Americans. The first gay political movement in the U.S., the homophile movement of the 1950s and 1960s, sought civil rights, full citizenship, and recognition that we are just like heterosexuals. When America most vigorously defined itself as heterosexual, homosexual activists sought inclusion rather than freedom. The crusade against sexual deviancy began in earnest in February 1950, when a State Department official testified to Congress that the department was riddled with homosexuals. This inaugurated a 5-year period in which the Senate investigated perverts in government. The FBI conducted surveillance of thousands of Americans' sexual practices. The armed forces doubled the number of discharges of alleged deviates. President Dwight Eisenhower banned homosexuals from federal jobs. Prospective employees were required to undergo screenings of their sexual histories. Municipal police departments conducted thousands of raids on gay bars and cruising areas, and newspapers reported the names and addresses of men and women arrested for illicit sexual practices. In response to the anti-homosexual culture of the 1950s, members of the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, and the Janus Society, the 3 major homophile organizations, adopted the politics of respectability of the civil rights movement. Members of the organizations wore business suits and conservative dresses. They were expected to adhere to Ivy League fashion. No swishing and no bottled-in blonde men, limp wrists, and lisping were permitted. At social gatherings, they showed only scientific documentaries about homosexuality that had been approved by the Supreme Court. No muscle movies were allowed. The groups explicitly banned drag queens and bull dykes from their meetings and demonstrations. And its political activities were limited to seeking sympathetic scientists to conduct research that would demonstrate that homosexuality was normal. The Mattachine Society adopted a resolution disavowing any direct, aggressive action in pursuit of its goals. Virtually repeating the words of Martin Luther King Jr. and other assimilationist leaders of the civil rights movement, the Janus Society argued all homosexuals to adopt a behavior code which would be beyond criticism and which would eliminate many of the barriers to integration with the heterosexual world. Early in the history of the Mattachine Society, one of its founding members argued for a different way. Chuck Rowland, who had grown up in a small town in South Dakota where homosexuality was never discussed, and who had served in the Army during World War II, knew the straight world as well as anyone. Yet, at a 1953 convention of the Mattachine Society, Rowland attacked the politics of assimilation. "We must disenthrall ourselves of the idea," he said, "that we differ only in our sexual directions, and that all we want or need in life is to be free to seek the expression of our sexual desires." The dominant heterosexual culture had excluded them, and, as a result of this exclusion, we have developed differently than have other cultural groups. Rowland called for Mattachine members to affirm rather than hide their desires, pleasures, behaviors, and identities, and to focus on creating an ethical homosexual culture. This was the last call for gay affirmation and autonomy for a generation. Rowland was defeated at the convention by leaders of the organization who committed it to the position that the sex variant, homosexual, is no different from anyone else except in the object of his sexual expression, and that homosexuals should adjust themselves to a pattern of behavior that is acceptable to society in general and compatible with the recognizable institutions of home, church, and state. At the 1963 conference of the East Coast Homophile Organizations, according to one magazine report, deadly respectability was the keynote, and everyone was conservatively dressed. On the floor of the conference, no swishing was allowed in public. and a couple of local queens who sashayed up to one session were told politely but firmly to go home and come back only if they were properly dressed and behaved. The report concluded that, because they are so earnestly seeking respectability, the organizations discourage the obvious effeminates. The keynote speaker for the conference, a big but pretty woman named Joan Fleischman, later said that masculine men and feminine women were good public relations for the homophile movement, and that she was selected as convention chair in part because she did not look like the stereotypical bull dyke. When homophile organizations staged protests, they consisted of marching in silence for a few minutes, then departing quickly and without a word. They demanded that in public, their members demonstrate not the slightest hint of sexuality, not even touching or hand-holding. Leaders of the organizations insisted again and again in their public statements that the majority of homosexuals are, in everything but their sexual inclinations, no different than anyone else. They enforced a code of silence about sex and attacked the swishy type of homosexual who brought contempt and derision on the majority of homosexuals. They sought to erase the renegade history of the gay subculture and to make themselves into respectable Americans. One could certainly argue that the strategy of respectability was necessary in the conservative era of the 1950s and early 1960s, but it was also an abject failure. The respectable movement failed to end police harassment. It actually increased in the 1950s and 1960s. Won no civil rights, and by eliminating the most powerful form of sexual dissent in American culture, actually contributed to the sexual conservatism of the time. Something else entirely happened in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village. When police from the city's public morals squad arrived to arrest gay patrons and the mafiosi running the bar, many of the 200 patrons resisted arrest. Some ran away, others refused to produce their identification, and others marched out of the bar flaunting their sexuality. Several of the customers who made it out the front door staged mock performances for the crowd by posing and saluting the police in an exaggerated fashion. As one newspaper report put it, wrists were limp, hair was primped, and reactions to the applause were classic. Black, white, and Puerto Rican drag queens in high heels and butch lesbians wearing crew cuts and leather jackets threw bricks and bottles at the officers, set fire to the building, and, most stunningly, chanted, "We're faggots, and we're not going home." Sylvia Rivera, who was in full drag and had been in the Stonewall during the raid, remembered, "You've been treating us like shit all these years." "Uh-huh. Now it's our turn. It was one of the greatest moments in my life." When the tactical police force arrived to quell the riot, several members of the mob began an impromptu chorus girl kick line singing, "We are the Stonewall Girls. We wear our hair in curls. We don't wear underwear. We show our pubic hairs." One observer recalled a scene that was the virtual opposite of what the homophile organizations had counseled, and one of the great renegade moments in American history. "I saw a bunch of guys on one side of the cops over there, and the cops with their feet spread apart and holding their bully clubs straight out. And these queens all of a sudden rolled up their pants legs into knickers, and they stood right in front of the cops. There must have been about 10 cops one way and about 20 queens on the other side. They all put their arms around one another and started forming a kick line, and the cops just charged with the nightsticks and started smacking them in the heads, hitting people, pulling them into cars. I just can't ever get that one sight out of my mind. The cops with the nightsticks and the kick line on the other side. It was the most amazing thing. What was more amazing was when the cops charged. That's when I think anger started, and the cops were used to us calling them Lily Law, so the cops were used to some of camp coming from us. And all of a sudden, that kick line, which I guess was a spoof on their machismo, making fun of their authority, I think that's when I felt rage, because people were getting smashed with bats. And for what? A kick line. Randy Wicker, who had marched for gay citizenship in a business suit in front of the White House in 1965, said the screaming queens forming chorus lines and kicking went against everything that I wanted people to think about homosexuals, that we were a bunch of drag queens in the village acting disorderly and tacky and cheap. The next night, an even larger crowd showed up at the bar. Another riot broke out, and protests were held every night for the next 5 days. Poet Allen Ginsberg, who as a teenager in 1943 had discovered in himself mountains of homosexuality, noticed a new countenance on the Stonewall rioters. You know, the guys there were so beautiful. They've lost that wounded look that fags all had 10 years ago. Whereas homophile movements had avoided using the word gay in any of their publications, a group calling itself the Gay Liberation Front, GLF, formed soon after Stonewall. Within 6 months, New York activists launched newspapers called Gay, Gay Power, and Come Out. Their combined readership climbed to between 20,000 and 25,000 within a year. The so-called gay liberation movement that followed ended police harassment, broke open notions of what it meant to be a man or a woman, and broadened the sexuality of a whole generation of Americans, queer and straight. Before Stonewall, it was commonly assumed that homosexuality was a sickness or an evil, and gay meeting places were officially illegal in every city. After Stonewall, a massive gay liberation movement emerged in the United States and around the world. In 1970, tens of thousands of men and women gathered in New York's Central Park and in Griffith Park in Los Angeles for enormous, organized coming-out parties, and the first gay pride parades were held across the country in June 1970 to commemorate the Stonewall Rebellion. Through the 1970s, several gay liberation organizations were established in the United States, as well as in countries around the world. Gay and lesbian studies programs were established in universities, and homosexuality became a common theme in Broadway plays and Hollywood movies. Most dramatically, in the lives of gays and lesbians, city governments ended police harassment of gay bars and bathhouses. In the years after Stonewall, gay bars, even in small towns, no longer camouflaged themselves, and by 1977 there were at least 129 openly gay bathhouses in the United States. For heterosexuals, gay liberation transformed life in countless ways. Sex was brought not just out of the closet, but also out of the home. The rampant and unabashed public gay sex of the 1970s pioneered on the Christopher Street docks, in the backs of trucks parked in the meatpacking district, at St. Mark's Baths, in the sand dunes of Fire Island, in gay clubs, and in West Village doorways, induced America to take off its clothes. Non-marital, non-procreative, purely recreational sex, the only kind homosexuals could practice, was legitimized for the first time in American culture. Soon after Stonewall, the joy of sex, which only a few years earlier would have been banned as pornography for its hundreds of pictures of copulating couples, spent 70 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and introduced millions of heterosexuals to sexual positions previously thought to be degraded and perverted. Before Stonewall, oral sex was considered to be the practice of prostitutes and homosexuals. The medical sexologist Edwin Hirsch wrote in 1934 that oral sex is generally regarded as loathsome and indicative of a sad degree of sexual perversion. Through the 1960s, medical experts commonly referred to oral sex among heterosexuals as a disorder and deviation of aim. The first medical experts on homosexual practices, such as David Rubin, whose best-selling Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, but Were Afraid to Ask, appeared in 1969, just before the Stonewall riots. averred that oral sex played a big role in homosexual activity, but that for most heterosexuals, the big question was, should you do it? After Stonewall, almost everyone was doing it. Before Stonewall, Fire Island, the playground of thousands of New York gay men, was the only beach in America where nudity was tolerated by authorities. After Stonewall, illegal nudity at beaches along both coasts increased markedly. By 1973, substantial sections of various beaches, including Cape Cod National Seashore, Moonstone Beach in Rhode Island, Venice Beach in Los Angeles, and Black's Beach in San Diego, had been colonized by nudists. That year, Eugene Callan and other heterosexual nudist activists founded Beachfront USA as a protest and lobbying group to establish legal nudity on American beaches. By the following year, it was estimated that more than 1,000 nudists appeared daily on Venice Beach. Naturism spread on the East Coast shortly thereafter. Portions of beaches from Florida to Maine, where the hardiest of naturists ventured, were taken over by nudes in noticeably greater number by the mid-1970s. In 1978, Lee Baxendall, who found his passion among the clothes-free crowds at Cape Cod, began publishing Free Beaches magazine and created the Free Beaches Documentation Center, collecting data from all over the world on nude beaches. Later, he published Lee Baxendall's World Guide to Nude Recreation, a color guidebook locating places to go nude all over the world, which became the Bible of naturists around the world. Baxendall and Callan later launched, without government approval, National Nude Weekend and National Nude Week. The soundtrack to the sexual revolution of the 1970s was disco, which, as we have seen, was created by black gays in New York. It was made popular in the gay clubs of Fire Island and the West Village, then dominated American popular music through the decade. Until Stonewall, psychologists not only considered homosexuality to be a mental illness, but also thought of masculinity and femininity as inversely proportional within an individual. The more feminine a person was, the less masculine he or she was, and vice versa. After Stonewall, the psychological profession as well as the culture at large changed its mind on both notions. Emboldened by Stonewall and the burgeoning gay freedom movement, in May 1970, activists with the Los Angeles chapters of the Gay Liberation Front, GLF, infiltrated a conference on behavior modification by the American Psychiatric Association, APA. During a film demonstrating the use of electroshock therapy to decrease same-sex attraction, GLF members shouted, "Torture!" and "Barbarism!" then seized the microphone to declare that doctors who prescribed such therapy for their homosexual patients were complicit in torturing them and that homosexuals were not mentally ill. 2 years later, apparently sensing a national mood change, the APA invited gay activists to speak at the organization's national conference. And in 1973, the APA Board of Trustees voted to remove the category of homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That same year, the psychological profession adopted the Byrne Sex Role Inventory, a scale that measured masculinity and femininity as separate and coexistent within an individual. Thus, Americans began to speak not just of feminine and masculine personalities, but also of androgynous types, people who were both masculine and feminine, or neither. Today's movement for gay marriage, a renewal of the homophile movement, ended gay liberation, is helping to end straight liberation, and seeks to return all of us to the 1950s. Like the homophile movement, the gay marriage movement demands that, in order to gain acceptance as full citizens, its constituents adopt the cultural norms of the American citizen: productivity, selflessness, responsibility, sexual restraint, and the restraint of homosexual expression in particular. Proponents of same-sex marriage have justified their demand by presenting homosexual partners as devoted, self-sacrificing, and industrious adults. Unlike the post-Stonewall gay pride movement, whose annual marches featured masses of naked and semi-naked people in celebrations of their sexual openness, the gay marriage movement presents its constituents as sexless and their relations as platonic. Calls have been made by leaders of the movement to ban drag queens from the marches and to institute a dress code for marchers. The suppression of sex and the language of respectability are evident on the websites operated by gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender civil rights organizations. In the early 2000s, the website of Lambda Legal featured profiles of gay and lesbian couples, all of whom were identified as long-term couples with respectable jobs, and many of whom were described as committed parents and grandparents. Among the featured couples was Colonel Margaret Kammermeyer and Diane Divelbes, respectively the recipients of a Bronze Star for distinguished service in Vietnam and an accomplished former professor. In the site's section on gays in the military, scores of homosexual members of the armed services offered lengthy accounts of their military accomplishments and nothing on their sexuality. This exchange of desire for responsibility was well illustrated by Carolyn Conrad, whose civil union with Kathleen K.P. Peterson was the first of its kind in the United States, following the enactment in 2000 of a Vermont law allowing same-sex couples to become legal spouses. "When I first met K.P., I loved her because she rode a motorcycle," Conrad said. "And now I love her because she makes the payments on her motorcycle." Advocates for gay marriage insist that such a reform is necessary to acquire many long-denied rights. Yet virtually all those civil rights have been won in Europe through domestic partner laws and in the majority of major companies in the United States, which give full benefits to non-married domestic partners. The implications for gay, lesbian, and transgender people are clear, but for straights, they are no less world-defining. The homophile and gay marriage movements did tell us that the nuclear family is the destiny for all of us who wish to be healthy. Above all, they tell us not just that homosexual acts should be hidden and contained, but as the Puritan strain in American culture has told us from the beginning, all sex should be hidden and constrained. For those who reject that notion, the queers of the Stonewall era should be national heroes.